Welcome back to Inclusive Design 2024, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Barrier Break and Intopia, and our Gold supporters, Barrier Break, Infoaxia, and Tetralogical. You can follow us on Mastodon, Blue Sky, Twitter, and LinkedIn. If you have questions for the presenters, post them using the ID24 hashtag, or you can post your questions in the YouTube chat. We'll gather your questions for our Q&A at the end of the session. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. I am honored to be joined by my guest host, Bruce Lawson. Bruce, over to you.
Hi, Kathleen. Thank you. Next, we have Simona Manni, and joining us for the Q&A afterwards is Belen Barros Pena, and they're going to tell us about neuro-diversifying tech, a toolkit for designing with autistic people. So over to you, Simona.
Hello, thanks so much for having me. Yes, I will be presenting this talk about neurodiversifying tech, in particularly introducing a toolkit for designing with autistic people, which resulted from a project, an academic research project called Autistic Adults Online. And let me just see, yep. I will be introducing the research team. I will tell you about the research project itself and some of the methods, findings, and features that we developed as part of it. And I will be presenting the toolkit, which encapsulates all of this and hopefully present it to you in a way that is immediately applicable to designing and that you can access online. So just to talk about the research project, the toolkit emerged from, it was called Autistic Adults Online. It's a research project that was run for 2 years at Queen Mary University of London, which investigated how autistic adults communicate and interact on social media platforms. I'm going to be spending a few words just introducing the team. The project was led by principal investigator Professor Nelia Koteiko, who's a professor of language and communication at Queen Mary University of London, and was co-investigated by Professor John Vines, who's chair of design informatics at the School of Informatics, University of Edinburgh. There were collaborators from the third sector in the UK, Autistica and Autistic Nottingham, who were partners in the project. And then there was a team of researchers, which included Martin van Driel, who's now assistant professor in English language and communication at the University of Birmingham, Belen, who's with us today, was a lecturer in HCI at City, University of London, and who developed most of the methods which we'll be discussing today. And then I joined the project as in its last part. And I worked at the dissemination of the research findings, which also included developing this toolkit. And I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of York at the Institute for Mental Health Research. So this is all of us. And moving on to the research project itself. Autistic Adults Online was a research project informed by the Neurodiversity movement. And I will be telling you more about this in the next few slides. And let me just move things around a little bit. Yes, our research aim was to explore how autistic adults use social media, how they feel about the way social media platforms work, and how the way this platform works can impact their interactions in a positive or negative way. We found that it was really important to understand really well how autistic individuals prefer to use language, images, and different tools to communicate, so that we can then design environments that are more inclusive to neurodivergent users, in particular, in this case, autistic adults. We used a participatory research approach where autistic individuals were involved not just as research participants, but also as researchers, as advisory board members, and then they were involved into the decision-making that shaped the research itself. And the sort of background for this research was previous research, which looked at how social media has the potential to provide safe spaces for autistic users, where hopefully they might feel at times more comfortable communicating and perhaps in a way that's more protected at times compared to face-to-face interaction. And some platforms like Facebook and Reddit can also encourage interaction based around special interest and passions, which is what some autistic users prefer to socialize around. However, even though social media has this potential to support autistic users successfully, other research found that there is still quite a strong need for autistic users to mask, in a sense, to try and adapt to the neurotypical ways of communicating. So masking and trying to adapt to neurotypical ways doesn't just happen in face-to-face interaction, but can also be translated into social media. And that's because most social media platforms are shaped by the social needs of neurotypical people. And so there were some unanswered questions that encourage this research, and these are: how suitable can social media platforms be for autistic adults' social preferences and needs? And what can we learn from autistic sociality, which we'll talk about more in a minute, about the design of mainstream social media platforms? So what made this project quite unique was that it used a participatory approach as opposed to participants' observation, interviews, and surveys that most related research used before, but also the focus was really on social media platforms and how they should change and adapt, rather than trying to investigate how autistic people should, in a way, change their behavior, of how they change their behavior to adapt to social media platforms. So our aim was to try and see how we can shape social media platforms to make them more inclusive. And the project worked through 3 different phases. In phase 1, researchers used an approach called this linguistic ethnography, where they gathered a lot of post and online activity from autistic adults, a pool of autistic users, and they analyzed it linguistically to see what type of affordances, communicative affordances, were preferred by autistic users and how they tend to navigate social norms. There was then a second phase, and this is what we'll be focusing today mostly, which used participatory design. There were 12 workshops with 20 autistic adults, where they used hands-on approaches to better understand how social media works for them and how it should change to better support their social needs. And we found that social media can pose a series of challenges to autistic users, in response to which they are in a way forced to develop a series of coping mechanisms. And we also developed a series of directions toward which social media should go in order to better support autistic sociality. And then there was a third phase where we worked to disseminate the findings from these first 2 phases of the research. And this dissemination also included developing a toolkit that designers could use based on this research. And this is the toolkit itself. You can use this QR code to access the toolkit freely from GitHub. And there are some academic papers, some quite impactful academic papers that were published from this project, but we were really keen that also there could be some resource which was immediately applicable for UX designers, researchers, and developers, so that what we found in this research project could be made useful to others. It could have a direct impact on the professional practice of UX designers. In order to make this toolkit as relevant as possible, we ran a series of workshops with UX designers from around the world, where we presented the projects and the findings, and then we tried to package the toolkit in a way that was as relevant and as immediate, short, and effective as possible. If you do download the toolkit, you will see that there is a way of providing feedback. So we would really welcome you, if you're using the toolkit, to please let us know what you think of it, because we can still change it and improve it, and we really would welcome your feedback. Now I'm going to basically go through the different sections of the toolkit, which quite closely reflect some key elements of the research project itself. So I will take you through some of the concepts, some of the methods, and the findings that are part of this toolkit and are part of the research project the toolkit comes from. And some of this information is probably very familiar to a lot of you in the audience, but I hope that it can still be useful to go through it. And in particular, the first part of the toolkit is dedicated to discussing neurodiversity and autism. So this research project was informed by the neurodiversity movement. A social justice movement emerged in the late 90s that looks at different neurodiversities, not just autism, but also others, and advocates for a view in which these are not conditions that need to be fixed, but are rather predisposition that different humans have, and that are probably related to our journey in a way of evolution of genetic legacy, in the sense that if we were not diverse as humans, if there weren't some of us that are more detail-oriented, or some of us that are better at looking at the bigger picture, we wouldn't probably have evolved as well as we have as humanity. And so these are not things that should be fixed or normalized in a sense of creating an environment where we're all the same, but should rather be valued and supported. And these are some of the neurodiversities in question. So we don't just have autism, but also ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and so on. These are all different ways in which different individuals can perceive the world and communicate with others, and are not conditions that should be cured. And so by adopting this approach, we are hoping to design platforms that are modeled around these different ways of perceiving the world, and not just the neurotypical sort of standard way of relating to the world around us. When we talk about autism, these are some information that we found from a partner in the project. Again, the language here is a little bit maybe imprecise, because we don't like to talk about symptoms. There is, again, a term that tends to transform autism into an illness, but rather maybe characteristics. But I'm going through some of them, just those that are more relevant to the project and what we found, with a caveat that, of course, each single autistic individual can have a different and really unique ways of perceiving the world. And these are not things, this list of characteristics are not the same for each autistic person, and are not really happening all at once or at the same, in the same way for each individual. But some of the recurring things that were found in relation to autism is, for instance, a preference towards structure and order. So things being quite streamlined, clear, and well articulated, and a dislike for some autistic individuals towards things that are not, say, disruption in routine, or things that are changeable and don't give them time to adjust their expectations around what's going to happen. So structure and order are quite important. For some autistic people, there is a tendency toward literality as opposed to metaphorical thinking. So some autistic individuals can take things quite literally, and again, there is this tendency towards precision. Some autistic people can have a co-occurring condition, which is called alexithymia, where it can be slightly more difficult for them to decipher emotional intent, both in tone of a speech or in deciphering, for instance, facial expressions. And these are things that are not an issue in themselves. They can become, when we design social media features that don't take any of this into account, we can create an experience for autistic users which can be not inclusive and not comfortable. Sometimes when discussing autism, there is this mentioning of difficulty making friends and socializing, but this is, again, it's an ambiguous symptom, because research found that autistic individuals don't have any issue socializing with each other. And so it's not so much that there is a difficulty in making friends, is that the type of sociality that can be associated with autism can be different from the neurotypical one, and it's just a matter of finding ways to communicate with each other. We found this post online where someone who's defining themselves as autistic is describing others as if neurotypical have a disorder. And the disorder of neurotypicals is that they say things that they don't mean, they don't care about structure, they're not capable of hyper-focusing on important topics, they may have unreliable memories. And this is just a humorous way of showing that there isn't one way that is superior or more or to be preferred to the other. These are different social styles, and that's why we talk about autistic sociality. And then there could be neurotypical socialities, and we should develop social media platforms that can accommodate both rather than just one of them. And so this is just something that we tend to spend a bit of time talking about in the toolkit as well for designers, so that it's quite clear the framework where the project comes from. And this is all discussed in the first chapter of the toolkit. Because again, neurotypical ways are usually mainstream in the development of social media platforms, and we want to change that, we encourage designers to use a participatory approach. You're probably all familiar with this, but in participatory design, we think that it's quite important that people that will use certain technologies are involved in the decision-making around how they should look like and they should work. So end users shouldn't be just a source of information for technologists, or they shouldn't just be evaluators of platforms at the end, but they should be active contributors of design ideas and decision makers. And this is the approach that we encourage people to use in this toolkit, and we used for this project. And in terms of making participatory design work alongside neurodiversity, it means that taking neurodiversity into account, we are not placing the responsibility on a neurodivergent individual to adapt to platforms that are created for neurotypicals, but rather we take into account the needs of diverse users as we go along from the start. Before going into how we applied a participatory design process to our work, we have another part of the toolkit which discusses some of the social media challenges that autistic users can experience as they emerged in our research project. So our research found that as we expected, many digital services and platforms are not doing enough to support the communicative and sensory needs of autistic users. And this resulted in a series of challenges that we have identified with our research participants. I will briefly try to describe them. And I just wanted to point out before I go through them that these challenges really affect any user. But for some autistic users, they can be particularly impactful, or they can have a more long-lasting effect on their social media usage and how they feel afterwards. One of these is audience uncertainty. So the fact of not, in many social media platforms, it's quite unclear who is going to access your content, who are you actually talking to. And this ambiguity can be particularly confusing for some autistic users that might prefer things to be quite clear and certain. And most social media platforms are not doing enough to support users in setting privacy boundaries in a way that is clear and streamlined. And we found that, yes, our participants, most of them disliked the uncertainty around the audience. The use of emojis and GIFs can be particularly confusing for some autistic users, both because they rely on in a stylized representation of emotional tone, which might not be that clear for people that have alexithymia, and also because the use is so contextual and nuanced that it can be really difficult to understand when it's appropriate to use which. And this is something that our research participants discussed quite a lot. Sensory overload can be an issue. This can be triggered both by the amount of content, so the amount of information that gets to a person, especially if this information is not organized around clear themes, but it can also be more literally a lot of moving images of sound that plays unexpectedly, and the lack of ways of control the sensory stimuli that comes towards a user. Our participants also talk about some challenges around conveying and interpreting meaning. The fact that at times the way Some autistic users might prefer to communicate, which is quite straight to the point and clear-cut, can be interpreted online as rudeness, and this can create lots of issues in communicating, and also could push autistic users to mask when they are writing content as well, or trying to make it more palatable, or adding pleasantries that they might feel are unnecessary, but that in a way allow them to be more accepted by neurotypical users. Some autistic users prefer to socialize around common interests and passions, and not always there is enough of this on social media. So for some of them, it's not that meaningful to connect just based on the fact that you are from the same town or you have common friends, but there should be more around shared passion. Poor content quality was a challenge that revolved around the amount of harmful, hostile, or just irrelevant content that can come to a user. Again, this can have quite a highly distressing effect on some autistic participants. And then compulsion to use is a challenge around the fact that social media is designed to trigger FOMO, fear of missing out. For some autistic participants, they may feel particularly obliged to respond to every interaction or to be on top of all notifications, and this can create even more of an addictive, in a way, experience of social media that pushes some users away. So some users prefer not to engage with social media at all because of that. So these are some of the main challenges we found, and we also found a series of coping mechanisms that some autistic users have to develop to meet these challenges. And in order to create social media platforms that hopefully minimize this challenging as much as possible, we proposed a participatory process, which can be used by designers to work with participants, not just autistic participants, but any group of participants really, but a process that works in 3 phases. First, we have a descriptive phase where participants describe the way they prefer to use social media and the challenges they find. There is a reflective phase where the discussion around social media use goes a little bit more in depth. And then there is, quite crucially, a making phase where participants can develop new social media features in order to mitigate the challenges that they experience. All of these 3 phases have different methods attached to them, which were existing methods that were tailored by Belen to fit this type of workflow. So for the descriptive phase, we used a method called evidence safari. For the reflective phase, we used a method called questionable concepts. And for the making phase, we used design cards. And today, and also in the toolkit, we focus on the descriptive phase, evidence safari, and the making phase, designing with cards. While we didn't really propose an activity for the questionable concept, because these are quite complex ways of aiding reflection, which work really well in an academic context, and they can certainly be used in practice as well, but not in a way that was as immediate and as applicable as the first and the third phase of the project. So what I will do now is that I will present these methods to you, show you how we use them, and then encourage you hopefully to use them yourself if you like. All the materials and the cards that I will be discussing are accessible through the toolkit. So if you go to the link that we provided earlier, you can download everything and then decide if you want to use these methods printed out in a face-to-face workshop, or if you would prefer to use them on a digital board. The first method that we used for the descriptive phase of this participatory process is called evidence safari. This is an approach that was developed mostly in policy work and government work, but can be applied to design as well. It's very useful when you start with some data. So very often it can be it can be really quite difficult for a group of participants that never got together before to start discussing an issue from scratch. So if you can start from some data, which could be around a platform that you're developing, or it could be a research that is relevant to your project, it can be an opening point for discussion that makes it a lot easier for participants to start working. In our case, we developed a series of evidence cards, which were based on the first part of the research, which had already happened around the way autistic users tend to prefer using social media. And we packaged it to a series of cards. So in Evidence Safari, you start with some data, you can organize it around key themes, and then you transform it into a set of cards. And that's also really useful because usually when you start working with a group in workshops, they don't have enough time or to absorb complex data. So organize it around key themes and then proposing it through cards can be a lot more immediate, and it's usually really good at starting conversations and discussions. So this is an example of an evidence card that was developed for this project. This is around the fact that some of the research participants we worked with expressed that they prefer to use comments online rather than starting new threads, because using comments reduces in a way the ambiguity and manages the expectations a little bit better. So you're commenting on something that already exists, but you're not starting a new discussion from scratch. And some of our participants prefer to use comments. So in this first card, we have a visual representation of the data. We have a very short and clear statement of key information, and you have the theme stated there. So everything is quite in a very manageable chunk. We used dyslexia-friendly style guide that we would encourage anyone to use for this type of materials, where Belen showed us how she changed the design of the cards from what you see on the left to what you see on the right to make it more dyslexia-friendly. So the type of font that you use, the colors, the contrast, and the spacing all should be designed to be as inclusive as possible. And yes, we developed these sets of evidence cards that you can access through the toolkit. This is an example of how they can be used in Miro. And we organized the evidence cards around 2 different types of content. Some cards are dedicated to the way autistic adults tend to use social media as it emerged from our research, and we talked about comments already. And so another set of cards is dedicated to the challenges that we discussed earlier. So how social media can pose certain challenges, especially to autistic users, and how they might develop coping mechanisms to meet these challenges. So just to tell you a little bit more about these categories, cards that are dedicated to social media use are based on the first phase of this research, and they provide key info on how autistic adults engage with social media. So we talked before about special interest. In this card, the card on the left, you see an example of a user who is socializing around watercolor. And so there is a full set of cards that discuss how special interests are managed. Then you have another set of cards that is dedicated to avoiding conflict, which is, again, a concern that a lot of our participants expressed, and it describes all the different ways in which our autistic participants try to avoid conflict, especially with neurotypical users online. And then you have challenges cards. This example is around compulsion to use that we discussed before, so how social media addictive nature and fear of missing out that often get triggered can be particularly impactful for autistic users, and how some don't see any other coping mechanism that withdrawing completely from using social media. So these are all important data that is quite key to discuss if you want to develop platforms that are more inclusive. And by using these cards, you can bring the discussion to groups in your workshops and hopefully see if they relate to these themes and how it affects your group of participants. At the end of each evidence card set, you also have a series of questions that are designed to encourage reflection and get your participants to discuss with one another and to relate what they read in the cards to their own experience. So we found that this method was really useful. And when we used it with our own participants, we found some key takeaways that we really discussed already, so that autistic adults tend to prefer social media interaction that are interest-led. that the impact of confrontation and hostile content can be really distressful. That some wish that there was more support in clarifying tone and intention, and also the meaning of emojis and GIFs. There was a lot around sensory overload and overwhelm, and overall a need of economizing energy and effort. So to make social media experiences as clear-cut, as streamlined, and economic in a way, so that this can be more useful for more inclusive autistic users, but really a better experience of social media for all. Because what we found as well, that we'll touch on later as well, is that when we make this adjustment for autistic users, we're actually providing a much better experience for neurotypical users as well. So there isn't really a us and them divide here. There is just the fact that some of these issues can be much more impactful for autistic users. These are some quotes from the research that convey some of the topics that we just discussed. So a participant said, I always have to go through everything 10 times. I'm worrying that I'm saying everything correctly. Does it make sense? Will people understand? Is my message clear? So this is something that one of our participants really worried about. And again, around conveying meaning, a participant said, I'm always trying to work out how you're meant to react. Are your emotion appropriate? How do you convey a certain meaning? And they found this constant effort really exhausting. And we also wanted to stress the fact that while some of these challenges, like sensory overload, for instance, could be typical of autism itself, many of the challenges we discussed are a result of the fact that neurodiversity is not accounted for on digital platforms. So this can be solved by designing environments that are more inclusive. Sorry, that will be repetitive, but this is the main message we're trying to convey. And in order to do this, we proposed also an activity of designing new features using cards again. These cards were developed by Belen. The fact that they are so useful is that cards can act as physical carriers of ideas, and they can really trigger combinatorial creativity. So especially if you're a bit stuck when it comes to design new features with participants, mixing cards together and see what comes out of sometimes even a random combination of cards can really be useful in thinking about new features. So these two methods work quite hand in hand. So the evidence safari is meant to create discussion around certain issues, and then design cards can be used to translate that discussion into new social media features. And there is a set of cards that can be downloaded called design cards, which are divided into three main groups. So you have a series of cards with the light blue that you see on the left, which are action cards, and they describe actions that can happen in a social media context, from blocking, allowing, connecting, reminding. So all the actions that can be performed on social media. Then you have these light yellow sets of cards, which are entities, and entities can be really anything that takes place that's into a social media space. It can be objects like buttons, it can be people like contacts or friends of friends or strangers, or it can even be attitudes. So in this case, rudeness. And then you have a series of cards that are blank that can be personalized by your participants. And this is the full set of cards. So they tend to describe anything that can happen on social media, both in entities and action. And the way we used them with participants was to invite them to combine them in order to imagine new features that could make social media better for them. And again, they can be used by printing them out, or they can be used digitally. An example is that if participants was discussing not wanting to see rude content on social media, they could use delete as an action to block the rudeness, it's on the left, from reaching their content, in this case, direct messages and feed and timeline. So this is quite a simple and immediate ways to get non-professionals to try and imagine new features that designers can then translate into features for their own platforms. And we use them quite successfully, both with our own participants in the research. We use them with students, and we also use them with UX designers that came to our workshops. it was really interesting that designers who used this activity ended up imagining a lot of the features in a similar way as our research participants did before. And so our research participants thought of many different features, around 40. I'm just going to briefly discuss some of them. One is Connect by Interest, which is a feature that is supportive of the interest-led sociality that we saw before, where you could search for something you're interested in, a topic, and then find a stranger to connect through that topic. And so someone from a research participant said, maybe I want to talk to more people who are interested in autistic parenting, or I want to talk to people who are interested in washing machines, and I'm thinking that I love to meet more people who like those things, but how to search them. And searching them by topic could be a really good way of connecting with them, which doesn't happen enough or is not supported enough on current mainstream social media platforms. Then this is another very interesting feature, Activate Stillness, where voice and audio and moving images can be deleted from reaching a feed or timeline of someone. So in a way, some kind of button that could allow you to switch off any visual stimuli or audio stimuli and only see things in a text version. Some widgets do this, so you can see this happening in some websites, but it's not something that is widely available, especially not on social media. And the person who created this feature said, you want your scrolling to be just be picture and text, no sound, no moving images. Because when you put your headphones in, it can be really startling, especially if the sound comes out of nowhere. So you remove any moving image and you have a calmer scrolling experience. And again, something that was interesting in relation to audience control was deleting after a certain time interval. So deleting content that you create after a time interval that you can set yourself. So a little bit like Instagram stories that disappear after 24 hours, but in a way that participants can actually decide the interval of time that they want the content to be visible for. So it's not imposed on them, but they can have a choice. And again, this can really help feel like there is agency over the content that you post and for how long it should be available to others. And audio preview is another feature that our participants thought about, where a text that is produced by them can be read aloud by an AI or some kind of voice, so that they can get a sense of the emotional tone that they are conveying in text through a voice that reads it out. And this can really help with conveying meaning. And I'm just going to briefly go through this because I'm running out of time, but there could be alternatives for emojis. So instead of being based on a stylization of a human face expression, there could be different types of images to be used, and users could be able to personalize them. Or there could be more explanation of how each emoji means. That's also something that could be really useful. At the end of the toolkit, we have a section on how what we think is good practice for running inclusive online workshops with autistic participants. So for instance, around the amount of breaks, the forms of engagement, in our experience, were more successful. The fact of being giving people the opportunity to prepare in advance and to come to an online workshop knowing what's going to happen. We focus mostly on online workshops because we found that it was the preferred ways of working for our participants, not because of COVID, but because it's a context that made them more comfortable in contrast with face-to-face workshops. And so we thought that it was useful to provide some support if you want to use this type of online workshops and materials, how to best support autistic users in the process. And this is all the last part of the toolkit. And finally, we also designed another toolkit for third and public sector organizations. This is less design focused. This is a toolkit for those who work in the third sector who might not be able to redesign features or platforms from scratch, but they have to use what's out there. So you have to use Facebook, for instance, Twitter, whatever is available to you. How can you manage it so that it's as comfortable as possible for users, taking into account everything we just discussed? So if anyone is working in those sectors and would like to look at something which is slightly less design focused, please feel free to also use this toolkit. And I arrived to the end of this presentation. It would be really, I thought it would be really good to work to close with this last quote, where we agree that the emotional and social life of autistic individuals are rich and nuanced, and they should inform the design of computing system, in this case, social media. And if you want to know more about Autistic Adults Online, you can refer to the website, and I've got the link there. But I would also encourage you to look at the new research project that our PI, Naila Kotego, is now leading, which is around, again, social media spaces, but this time looking mostly at autistic young people and their experience. There is quite a lot of interesting findings that are emerging there as well. And yeah, I hope that this was useful. I'm gonna just stop sharing my slides now.
Wow, that is what a fantastic presentation. There's just a lot of questions personally that I have, but thank you very much, Simona and Belen. I'm intrigued, but my question is, Bruce, do we have questions?
We have questions. Apologies, I have the questions on my monitor, so I'm going to look away, which doesn't mean I'm ignoring you. I just need a bigger screen. This one's from me, actually, but I'm really interested to know, because I've been involved in doing some user research. How did you recruit the autistic people that you got to help you with this? Like, were they people who were already on social media? Did you get people who had tried social media and disliked it? Or were you able to recruit people who hated social media and then potentially gave them trauma to have to use it and report back? What was the mechanism?
I wonder, Belen, if you would like to take some of this, because you were more involved in that phase. But as far as I know, it was mostly participants that were recruited through Autistica. So a charity that was an organization. Most of them, I think all of them, were using social media at the time, or have used it before. But please, Belen, let me know if, yeah.
That's the gist of it. We normally recruit through community partners, and Autistica is an organization that was created specifically to bring together researchers with the autistic community so that they can collaborate together. So they helped us recruit. All the people we recruited were users of social media to different degrees and of a different set. Most were torn about it. Role in their social lives, and they were really grateful that they existed. But at the same time, all of them, every single one of them, had negative experiences to share about their interactions in these platforms. And that's, I think, makes it really urgent that these platforms are capable of turning into something that is more suitable for autistic people, because they can deliver a lot of benefit, but not perhaps in the shape they currently are.
Gotcha. How much of the perhaps negative experience that people with autism have got from their, I'll rephrase, I'll start again. How much of the blame for the negative experiences that people have found can be laid at the door of the platform, or is it to do with just the fact that the majority of people, presumably the majority of people, are using those platforms and are neurotypical and don't know how to be supportive, or don't know that the person they are perhaps mocking or whatever is autistic and needs the help.
Yeah, I wish we had a clear answer for that. Oh, it's 70-30.
I wasn't really expecting a precise figure.
It is certainly a mixture of things, but I think our conclusion was that a lot of the blame is with the platforms. That doesn't mean that there's not a very big lack of understanding around how autistic people like to socialize and communicate with others. That exists. That's certainly the case. But a lot of the issues we saw can be traced in one way or another to the ways that these platforms are designed, and also to their financial, to their business models, and the way, the incentives they have to behave or to design in certain ways.
Without wishing to ambush you, so tell me if this is a mean question, but can you give me a tangible example of something that's designed in a way that makes things worse for somebody with autism? Oh dear. Belen's frozen for me.
I might start.
Sorry,
Oh.
my connection is it better now?
It is, yes.
Yeah. I have one example, but Simona, maybe you want to give yours and see if it's the same.
Mine, I don't know if it can be what sprang to mind immediately, and I don't know if it can be defined as a social media feature, but a practice maybe was around moderation. So something that came up quite a lot, especially when we discussed with the third sector around forums, was moderation. So say code of conducts that are quite ambiguous or really just generic, where users really struggle to understand exactly how it translated in practice. And then there wasn't enough space for discussing this question. So some autistic users we spoke to got banned for reasons that they couldn't understand. And there wasn't any way of appealing or talking to others. And that can be really upsetting. And we provided through the other toolkit, the one that I talked about at the end, a series of guidelines on how to make code of conducts that are clear and inclusive as possible. So in that case, say, be nice. What does it exactly mean, be nice? And how it means so many different things to so many different people that it can be really confusing. And we found that at times this effort of trying to be nice can actually create more misunderstandings. And so, yes, that's something that it's not really a feature though. So maybe, Belen, if you have a feature in mind, it could be interesting to,
The biggest one lack of control over the content. The fact that I cannot decide which posts I want to see, in which order I want to see them. That was an ginormous problem for people. And that is something that is certainly feasible to design for. The lack of control affects us all, particularly autistic people.
Thank you. Here's a question going back to the discussion phase you had with working with autistic people, informing the design. I'll read it out because my capacity to paraphrase has seemingly completely left me. I'm wondering how many of the individuals are adjusting how they explain thought processes due to neurodiversity or due to the trauma of continual feedback that how they communicate is wrong. And is that question asked of them?
Yeah, I think that was a major point of discussion because, again, it's this issue of translating some dynamics that are related to masking into social media as well. So I think the people that I talked to directly for the last phase of the project, but I imagine the first and second phase as well, they all had a history of being given negative feedback around how they communicated. Even though they weren't meaning anything harmful and negative, it's just the styling and sometimes the written form can be sounding more dry. That's why some asked for features like the read aloud feature, where something should support them into trying and understanding how they're conveying tone and meaning. But again, this is something that supports them into trying to communicate with neurotypical people, because if they were to communicate just with autistic people, this issue wouldn't arise. And that's also why there are some spaces where autistic people try to have a community just for themselves, where things are a lot easier and they can communicate without all this massive expectation of how this should be. Again, this is a really complex issue that is difficult to solve in a short way. But if at least we can use some of these methods to design more inclusive features, we hope that there could be an opportunity to have features that can mediate better the communication with others. But yeah, I don't know, Belen, if you want to add.
It seems to me that whereas we rightly get concerned about AIs, for example, getting biased because they might only be trained on neurotypical people, for example, there could actually be a really good case in a sentiment analysis AI being trained on neurotypical people only, so that autistic people could say, tell me how that sounds to that lot out there. So I know, I mean, assuming that people do want to, I guess mask is the word, but if people are concerned about how they are perceived, maybe a deliberately biased AI could actually be a boon in this particular instance.
And there were a lot of features that hinted at the potential of artificial intelligence to support that kind of thing, because the fact is that misrepresentation or misinterpretations of the way autistic people communicate cause them enormous trouble in day-to-day life, in educational environments, in work environments. So all of them acknowledge that it would be handy sometimes to be able to comply or to match the normative expectations.
Normative expectation, that's the phrase that were I academically gifted as you folks I would have used, but thank you. I appreciate that we're running that enormously out of time. So Simona and Belen, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Kathleen, you want to tell everybody to like and subscribe, I imagine?
Yes, I do. And I want to thank Simona and Belen for this amazing presentation. I learned a lot. And I want to say to everyone, thank you for joining us. If you like this session, hit that YouTube like button and don't forget to subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign24 to be kept in the loop on our future events. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with the thanks of our sponsors. And those are Barrier Break, Intopia, Infoaxia, Tetralogical, Intuit, Adrian Roselli, LLC, Assistive Labs, the Law Office of Delaney Feingold, Skyscanner, and Vispero. Inclusive Design will be back on the hour with our next session. See you there.